Last week we heard Rishi Sunak, when he was out and about, boasting about how he'd calmed down economic troubles and turbulence in this country. Privately, he's been saying to colleagues he takes credit as well for quietening down, calming down the embarrassing headlines. Well, those embarrassing headlines were back today. Nadhim Zahawi admitting pretty much that he didn't pay enough tax when it was due and has suffered a penalty from HMRC for paying late, and all of this happening, it seems, when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. And it appears as well as though, when you go back over the chronology of statements that Nadhim Zahawi has made, the public statements he's made since these allegations first surfaced, that he may not have been completely candid in his responses. And there is a strong suggestion tonight that when Number 10 was trying to work out what actually was going on in Nadhim Zahawi's finances last week, they maybe didn't get total candour, because Rishi Sunak came to the House of Commons last week for Prime Minister's questions and said, I paraphrase, nothing to see here. It stretches credibility that Rishi Sunak would have said that if he was in possession of the facts that we all are now in possession of. And Rishi Sunak, as you said, has ordered an inquiry into all of this. It rather makes you suspect that Nadhim Zahawi's career in Cabinet may not stretch as far as he might like. And it's a reminder as well that some of the embarrassments of the Boris Johnson era, which Rishi Sunak is so keen to live down, can come back and haunt you.
You resign as party chair, Mr Zahawi.
Nadhim Zahawi is now under investigation by the Prime Minister's ethics advisor. Number 10 said there were legitimate questions for the Conservative Party chairman to answer about his tax affairs.
Integrity and accountability is really important to me, and clearly in this case there are questions that need answering, and that's why I've asked our independent advisor to get to the bottom of everything, to investigate the matter fully and establish all the facts and provide advice to me on Nadhim Zahawi's compliance with the ministerial code. I'm pleased that Nadhim Zahawi has agreed with that approach and has agreed to fully cooperate with that investigation.
Getting it from a different perspective.
But that statement comes only 5 days after the Prime Minister said Nadhim Zahawi had dealt with all legitimate questions on the subject.
My honourable friend has already addressed this matter in full, and that's nothing more that I can add.
Over the weekend, Number 10 said it had learnt additional facts. And uncomfortably for Mr Zahawi, it seems it didn't learn them first from him. Some 2 decades ago, Nadhim Zahawi was the joint founder of the polling company YouGov, and he put his founder shares in a Gibraltar company controlled by his parents. Investigations have suggested those shares were sold over subsequent years, potentially for £27 million, with payments allegedly made to Nadhim Zahawi himself. That would normally attract a capital gains tax bill of £3.7 million. The Sunday Times says that amount, with a 30% penalty laid on top, has now been paid to HMRC, but that the dispute was only settled during Nadhim Zahawi's 63 days as Chancellor of the Exchequer last year.
It's clear from his statement, and I think now confirmed, that he absolutely did begin, conduct and finish negotiations with HMRC whilst Chancellor of the Exchequer. That to me is an impossible conflict of interest, and I don't understand how it was allowed to happen.
It's obvious that Zahawi can't stay as Tory party chair. The very idea that he can be discussing and negotiating his own tax affairs with the body that he's supposed to be running, everybody knows it's wrong. He clearly isn't going to resign, and so the Prime Minister needs to show some leadership.
Nadhim Zahawi's cabinet career does now look precarious, only 6 months after he launched his own leadership bid with a promise to be open about his financial affairs.
What about your tax returns?
That's what I'm talking about. My tax return I'll publish annually.
OK. Over the last decade?
Well, if I'm Prime Minister, I will publish them going forward. I don't think being retrospective is right. You know, I was in business before, I came out of that. Of course, I'm now in politics.
In a separate development, an investigation's been announced into how Richard Sharp was made chairman of the BBC. It's been triggered by the news that Mr Sharp put Boris Johnson, when he was Prime Minister, in touch with a distant cousin of his, Sam Blythe. Mr Blythe was keen to help cousin Johnson to ready cash guaranteeing a loan, and Boris Johnson took him up on the offer. Richard Sharp never disclosed his useful role as middleman, and that's triggered a review of how he got the BBC job. But in Whitehall, there's interest in claims that the Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case, said Boris Johnson didn't need to declare that loan because it was a family matter. The family link depends on a man born 200 years ago, Sir George Williams. Sam Blythe is his great-great-grandson. Boris Johnson is Sir George's great-great-great-grandson, which means he's Sam Blythe's third cousin, once removed. Some genealogists estimate Boris Johnson could easily have hundreds of cousins of the same closeness.
This government will have integrity, professionalism, and accountability at every level.
Rishi Sunak has boasted of how he has calmed things since he became Prime Minister. The ratio of embarrassing headlines down, the pace of politics too. These stories echo a recent era he wants to consign to the past, but which keeps coming back to haunt him.
Well, the chair of the Commons Committee on Standards, Labour MP Chris Bryant, joins us now from Westminster. Chris Bryant, when Rishi Sunak says questions need answering, isn't it justified for him to get his new ethics advisor to answer those questions?
Yes, that's a very good thing to do. However, I just note that only last week he pointed out that all of these questions had already been answered. So the question is actually, for me, is about Rishi Sunak, because when you look at the pattern ever since he became Prime Minister, first of all, you had Suella Braverman, apparently no questions asked about her having resigned only 6 days earlier, and suddenly she's reappointed as Home Secretary. Gavin Williamson, he didn't last very long. He had to go. You got Dominic Raab being investigated. I think there's still an investigation into Mark Spencer going on. And now you've got this.
OK, so bring it to this then, because Nadhim Zahawi says he's confident that he's acted properly throughout. If he simply settled a tax bill late and paid a penalty, other MPs have done the same, including your former leader, admittedly a different scale. But would he be in the clear then or not?
I don't know what you were referring to back there, but...
Well, Jeremy Corbyn paid his tax bill late. It was a different scale, but he did.
Right. I don't know about that. Look, I think... As I understand, I'm not an expert on tax policy and the processes that they go through, but the issue, it seems to me, for Nadhim Zahawi is whether he has told the truth at every stage during this process. Did he tell the Prime Minister when he was being, the new Prime Minister that is, when he was being appointed to the new job as Conservative Party chairman, for instance, that this was around and that he'd been dealing with this as Chancellor of the Exchequer? Did he tell Liz Truss when he became Chancellor of the Exchequer that this was something that he was going to have to deal with? Was there full openness with the public? Have there been fibs along the way? Because if any of those things are not as open and as transparent as everybody would want, I think there's a problem. But I think there's a bigger issue here, you know, which is that I think the public has the right to know, in relation to every single minister, within, I don't know, 48 hours, 72 hours of them becoming a minister, what all their financial interests are. I don't think a civil servant should be deciding, no, we're not going to publish that bit. It should all be published. The present list on the government website of government ministers' financial interests dates from last May. It's not an accurate list of ministers. It's not even an accurate list of the last set of ministers or the ministers before that.
OK, so there needs to be more transparency. Let's talk about the second potential conflict of interest story then over the BBC chairman.
Now, I may have difficulty here, Cathy, I warn you, because I understand that an allegation has been made to the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards, and that might therefore end up before my committee, so I have to be very careful that I'm
You're talking about Boris Johnson, of course, but I want to just stick on the BBC issue, which is if Richard Sharp simply connected a distant cousin of the former Prime Minister to the Cabinet Secretary to help Boris Johnson with his finances, and he didn't arrange the financing himself, what's the problem there?
He should have declared it. What's wrong with declaring it? Especially because the way that it's not the requirement to declare when you become chair of the BBC is not a very tight one, that it just has to be your financial interests. It's anything that might possibly appear to compromise might appear to be a conflict of interest. So, I think the danger here, I personally don't think that Prime Ministers should be appointing chairs of the BBC. I incidentally opposed this when the Labour Party did it, and I oppose it now. I don't think you should have a party political figure in charge of the BBC at all.
I'll come back to that in a minute, but just to put Richard Sharp's response, he says he reminded the Cabinet Secretary he'd applied for the BBC role, and they both agreed he should have nothing further to do with it to avoid any conflict of interest, and he says he didn't have any involvement then in that process.
But I think if the excuse me, but if the Cabinet Secretary is saying you shouldn't have any further involvement, that implies that the involvement that you've already had is a bit dodgy and therefore should be declared, would be my view. I don't understand. I think there is a problem when you don't have a ministerial an advisor on the ministerial code in place, because they keep on resigning because they're fed up to the back teeth of the lack of standards in Downing Street. There is a problem then that you can't get these things sorted properly.
He said he got the job on merit, but I wonder whether there's a broader question, which you sort of touched on a minute ago, that you said the Prime Minister shouldn't be appointing the BBC chairman. Should Tory donors be appointed to public appointments? Is that a broader problem here, that too many of them are? And does that potentially raise questions about BBC impartiality or not, given that the Director General of the BBC is the one in charge of editorial strategy?
Well, as I say, I would prefer if the chairman of the BBC and the Director General of the BBC had absolutely no party political affiliation and had never given to a political party. I think they should be appointed on merit because they understand broadcasting and public sector broadcasting in particular. And as I say, I said that when Labour was in government, even though, at one point Tony Blair, I think, appointed somebody who's now a Conservative peer. But in general, I think that arts organisations, prestigious arts organisations, these posts, as I understand it, the Conservative Party sent out a note to all its donors a couple of years ago saying, come on, folks, apply for all of these. And I think that that's inappropriate.
But, this has been going on for decades, hasn't it? And, when Labour came to power in 1997, after years of Conservative sleaze, you promised at that, your party promised to be whiter than white. It didn't work out that way. So is this just a sort of fin de siècle thing that you get to a government having been in power for years, and whatever political hue it is, there are problems?
Well, I agree with you that I think this is the fin de siècle. I mean, it feels like we're circling round the drain and everything. I think Rishi Sunak wanted to give the impression that all those terrible scandal stories were going to be a thing of the past because Boris Johnson was no more. And lo and behold, we're still discussing them. In fact, I think the proportion is kind of even higher under Sunak than it was under Johnson. But just one brief point.
Briefly, please.
I would say I wouldn't. If I were to suggest that I was whiter than white, you shouldn't trust me, Cathy.
All right.
No politician
ever is. I'll take you at your word on that. Depressing though that is. Chris Bryant, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, let's talk now to Sir Peter Riddle, who was the Commissioner for Public Appointments when Richard Sharp was appointed as BBC chairman. Sir Peter, when you were in that job and you were overseeing Richard Sharp's appointment, what checks were done to ensure that there was no perceived conflict of interest?
Well, the key there was the competition was run by the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. I took a very close interest in it, partly because at the beginning of the process, Number 10 had leaked to a preferred name, Charles Moore, who then withdrew, and then they indicated that Richard Sharp was a preferred candidate. I was quite angry about this because it implied that the whole thing was preset from the start. So I sought assurances from DCMS that there would be a properly robust and independent competition, and I took a close interest in it. There was an independent panel member who was there to ensure that the code was respected, a guy called Sir William Fittle, who alas died last year. But he was admirable in performing the function. I saw the papers of the process. I talked to Sir William and I talked to senior DCMS officials, and I was pretty happy that there was a robust process in which conflicts of interest, as far as we knew them, and I emphasise that, were addressed. It was known that Richard Sharp was a Tory supporter and was close to Boris Johnson and given money to the Conservative Party. That was all known.
Right.
The function which I was supervising was to ensure who were the appointable candidates. Then it becomes a political process. It's always going to be the final choice. It's going to be the Prime Minister or the Minister.
OK, so knowing what we know now, would you would you have carried on and, you know, given him carte blanche to be appointed if you'd known about this referral to the Cabinet Secretary of someone to help Boris Johnson with his vote?
My function was to ensure that all information was available to the interview panel and to ministers. It wasn't my function to make a choice.
Right.
That the regulators don't do that. Elected people do that. What I would have done was I would have hoped the information would have been known. That's certainly true. I'm a strong believer in transparency. There's always a question in these interviews, anything, it's the embarrassment question. Anything you've done in your background or what your associates would potentially embarrass. So I would hope, even though Richard Sharp says there was no conflict of interest, the mere fact that he'd been involved in discussions about that at an early stage of putting people in touch, even though he had no involvement in the loan, I think it would have been desirable that that would have been declared, because I bend over backwards. Even if it's not the letter of the code, it's much better to be much more open about what you declare.
Right, and just to repeat, he reminded the Cabinet Secretary he'd applied for the BBC role. They both agreed he should have nothing further to do with the matter to avoid any appearance of conflict. But given what you've just said and what we know now, do you think the chairmanship of the BBC appointment should be reopened?
That's a matter for the inquiry, which my successor, William Shawcross, has done. And I don't want to anyway prejudge what the inquiry does. The one important point to make is in the process which happened, Richard Sharp was a very strong candidate. I mean, I saw the papers, and he was a really very strong candidate. That was clear from everyone involved, and you know, with a lot of qualifications for the post. And one shouldn't underrate that factor.
Okay.
What happens now is a matter for the later inquiry, not for me.
You said you were angry about, you know, the sort of politicisation of the whole thing. Do you think it is a problem that so many supporters of this government are being appointed to public positions by this government?
No, I didn't say I was angry about politicisation. What I was angry about was the pre-leaking, the apparently prejudging as a result of these competitions. Now, when you say political appointees, yes, there are, as Chris Bryant said in the previous interview, in some prominent roles, but the actual number of people declaring political interest to get public appointments is less than 10%. It's quite small. It is certainly true in some of the national museums and galleries and other prominent roles. There are some, and there are a number of those. But that has happened under governments of all parties. I think it's a much more general thing, rather than specifically criticising this government or recent prime ministers. It's a long-term thing, and I think there may well be a case for a debate about should some roles be less political than they are. But ultimately, we do have elected ministers, and elected ministers, subject to accountability to Parliament, which isn't strong enough, should be the ones to take decisions, not people like me.
So, Peter Riddle, thanks very much for joining us.